Good evening again, friends. Welcome to First United Methodist Church. I'm Pastor Sarah, and I'm so glad that you are here this evening for our Conversation Matters series. The way that this will work today is we have the Reverend Dr. Kevin Riggs here to share with us, and when he finishes, there will be time for us to have some question and answer. It is very, very important that if you have a question, that you raise your hand and let me bring you the microphone so that we all can hear here, as well as those, as well as on the audio recording, that we'll be able to hear all of the questions. I will have some wipes in a moment. I will have some wipes to wipe the microphone off in between, but if you would please keep your mask on as you're asking questions, that will help us be able to share this one microphone. All right, well, friends, let's begin.
Make sure I stay way back from everybody. It's just a different day, is it not? But my name is Kevin. I pastor a church in Franklin, Tennessee called Franklin Community Church. That's in Williamson County, where our governor lives. And that's a whole other story. I don't know. But I've been a pastor for about 32 years now, and about 29 of those years have been in Franklin. I was born and raised in Nashville, and all my schooling was in Tennessee, from college all the way up through the doctorate program. From that, my mom is actually from Knoxville, and so when I was young, I lived here for a year or two in Knoxville, and then up until my grandmother passed away, we would come to Knoxville quite a bit, and then I'd come to Knoxville for the Tennessee football games. Got up here last night in time to get to the hotel so I could watch the game. And but that's ready for basketball season. We're a basketball school now. I've got some connections to Knoxville. My wife's family is actually from Monterey, Tennessee, and my wife's side of the family is United Methodist, and we're part of the United Methodist Church there in Monterey. From that, and back home, our church is involved in a lot of social justice issues. We're a poor income church or low income church in a high income city, is what I tell people about our church, because everybody thinks of Williamson County and Franklin as being this wealthy, which it is one of the more wealthy states or one of the more wealthy counties in the nation. In my hometown, in the month of August, the median sale price for a house in Franklin sold for over $1 million, but yet our church is low income church there. But so we do a lot of work with homeless, and the First United Methodist Church of Franklin is one of my biggest supporters. I don't know what I would do without them. So I feel like even though I'm not United Methodist, I've got some. I am Wesleyan, so that's close enough, right? But I have some United Methodist roots or backgrounds here. The reason I'm here is because a couple years ago now, Charles met me at a service or just a prayer vigil on the night of the last execution that Tennessee had before COVID hit. And I was supposed to come in August of that COVID year, and so it got put off. So I'm thankful that he stayed in contact with me on that, and we kept it on the record. But what I want to do is I'm just going to give you a quick background as to what got me into this particular aspect of it. And I really would rather have more time for questions, and then whatever questions you have about the death penalty or capital punishment or what life's like on death row and all that kind of stuff. I'd rather kind of go that and just assume for that. But I answered the call into ministry when I was 15 years old. And back then, that was a long time ago, I'm 55 now, but back then, in Nashville, kind of the two places that people who were really, really young got to preach was prisons and the rescue mission. Was kind of where I kind of cut my teeth preaching. And in a way, I couldn't wait till I got out of that so I could actually preach in a real church and not prisons and rescue missions, so prisons and homeless people. And to jump forward all these years later, about 10 years ago, I found myself exactly doing the same thing that I was doing back then. So God kind of brought me full circle to work with homeless people, but also feeling the need to go into the prisons. Our church, Franklin Community Church, started a nonprofit called Franklin Community Development, and there was 4 things that we wanted to deal with in that ministry, and it spells hope. So one was housing, which was emergency housing, homeless shelters, group homes, and those kind of things. The other one was occupational training, which we started a program in prisons to teach people basically job interview skills, how to put a resume together, and some of those kind of things. And then the P for Hope was prisoner care. And so we were involved in the local prisons, and the E is education. But so our church started getting involved in prison. Honduras is kind of my second home, and so when I was going to Honduras, I started going into prisons in Honduras. That's what this shirt is about. It's a church that we work with down there who made this church for me. This is their emblem. This is our church's emblem, and we work together in prisons down there. And so I became very, very active just in prisons. And then around 2013, there was an article in the Tennessean, the national paper, that said over the next 13 or 14 months, the state was going to execute 13 people. There were 13 dates set over this period of time. And for whatever reason, when I read that, God just stirred something in me that basically said, you need to do something about this. Well, what in the world can I do about that? And it was just, you need to go to death row. You're going to prisons, but you need to go to death row. And I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't even know where death row was. I knew it was in Nashville, but wasn't sure where it was. And so I got online, found a Tennessee for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, called the director. Her name is Stacy Rector, who is now a friend of mine. Told her, look, I don't know what your theological background is, but I believe God speaks to us, and he's told me I need to go to death row. I don't know how to get there. And so she put me in contact with the chaplain out of Riverbend Maximum Security Unit where death row is. Her name is Jeannie Alexander, and she's become a friend of mine now. She's not at Riverbend anymore. And so around 2014, I went to death row for the very first time with her. She brought me in to meet with some of the guys. And when I walked in, and these guys were sitting around a table, there was about 8 of them, and they would meet on Fridays for prayer back in the law library part of death row. And when I walked in and she introduced me, one of the inmates got up and he came over and he gave me a hug. And I never, and he said, I have been praying for you to come. And I was like, well, okay, you don't know me. And to make a long story short, his name is Kevin Burns. And he and I have become really good friends. And what he said was he had been praying that God would send a pastor, a local pastor, into death row to minister to them, because a lot of volunteers would go in and a lot of ministers would go in, but there really wasn't a pastor who was going in. So he and I developed a friendship, and over the years, and our church ended up ordaining him into the ministry. And so he's an ordained minister in our church, and he's on staff at our church. And he ministers to the guys on death row as one of the death row inmates. And what was really cool about that was during COVID, when all the programs got shut down for 15 months, he was still in, obviously, death row. He's an inmate. We helped him start a church called Church of Life with the inmates there. And so during COVID, they were able to keep going with their churches and with their Bible studies and everything because he was already there while no one else could come in. This is his picture over here. You can come up and look at it afterwards. From his ordination service. And so, but anyway, so I started going in from there. Those 13 inmates that were scheduled to be executed got together and filed a lawsuit against the state of Tennessee. And so the Supreme Court of Tennessee halted the execution dates until this lawsuit got heard. And the lawsuit had to do with the drug protocol for executions. And so in 2015 is when I finally got my badge, my volunteer badge, to be able to go in, and I go back into the units themselves. And I can go anywhere on Riverbend, but I mainly go there. I go to some of the other units, but mainly Unit 2 is death row. And then when Governor Lee became governor, they started executing, and about 8 of those 13 people have been executed now from that. And so in the time that I've been going to death row, there's been about 15 or 16 men who have died, half of those from execution, half of those from just natural causes. And I've known every one of them. They're friends of mine. Some of them I would be closer to than others. And I remember seeing them, knowing the routine, what would happen when somebody gets executed. Usually around Sunday night or Monday morning, they remove them from the cell and take them to the holding cell near either the electric chair or where they're going to be administered the drugs. And so I usually go on Fridays, and so I would see them on Friday knowing that that would be the last time I would see them, because then the executions would be on Thursdays, and we would have a vigil, and then I would go on Fridays after the executions just to talk with the guys. And so there's been about 8 of them. There were 3 or 4 that were scheduled to be executed over but COVID stopped it. And so right now, no one has been executed since the vigil that you guys came to, that I think was either January or February of 2020. So, but I have this fear that I'm going to wake up one day and the state Supreme Court is going to reissue those execution dates for the people. There's around 47, 48 guys on death row right now, and so you can add, and that's about how many guys were there when I started. And since I've been going, there's been 2 new people who have come on death row. One just a couple months ago. I don't know if you followed that case. He killed an officer in Dixon County and received a death penalty, and so he's been on death row for a very short period of time. Here's the way death row in Tennessee works. When you go into death row, you're classified as a level C. Tennessee is the only state in the country that has this leveling system on death row. And so a level C inmate is locked down in their own individual cell, about an 8 by 10 area, for 23 hours a day. They're supposed to be allowed an hour outside, but if they don't want to go outside, they don't have to. So many of them are just there. And so they're locked down 23 hours a day. They get an hour outside. They can't have any contact visits, which means if their family comes to see them, they talk to them through a glass, in an enclosed room, a glass. And no matter what happens, you're a level C inmate for a year and a half. If you don't have any write-ups during that year and a half, then you'll become a level B inmate. And the only difference between A and C is a level B inmate can have contact visits when people come to visit them. Not conjugal visits, but just contact visits where they can sit out around a table and hold hands and maybe give a little goodbye hug or something. But outside of that, they're still in their cells 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then after 18 months, if you have no write-up, so the first 3 years you're on death row, you're basically in solitary confinement. And if you don't have any write-ups, then at the end of that 18 months, you become a level A inmate, which is the best life is going to get for you. A level A inmate has more privileges. They're outside in a 24-hour period. They're outside their cell probably about 12 hours, either in their pods or working. They can get jobs on, they cook their own food and all that kind of stuff, or out on the rec yard, or whatever it may be. And so getting to a level A is what they want. And then if you get one write-up, if you do something wrong, then you go all the way back to level C, and it's going to be 3 years again before you get back out from that. And so about half the guys, maybe a little less than half, are level A. And so that's the guys that you can really start to get to know. I mean, I'll go cell to cell because of Kevin. Since Kevin's their pastor and he's also the chaplain's assistant for the institution, he can go into all the pods. And so if he and I can go from pod to pod and go from cell to cell and talk to the inmates and pray. And many of them only talk to me because of my relationship with him. His name is Kevin, my name is Kevin, so they call him KB and me Big K, kind of thing. And so our relationship is important for that. As a result, usually on the Thursday night of the execution, we would have a vigil outside. The night you guys were there was cold, wasn't it? That's why I remember either January or December. We'll have communion, we'll sing some songs, we'll pray while we're waiting to get word that the person has been killed. And then with Governor Lee, because Governor Lee ran his campaign on his Christian faith, then on Saturday before that Thursday, we started a march where we would march from River Bend to the state capitol. It's about an 8-mile walk. And then on Mondays, we would go into the state capitol to request to see Governor Lee. Because the guys on death row, about 13 of them wrote a letter and signed a letter. The letter basically said this: Governor Lee, we understand you're a man of faith, you follow Jesus. We're requesting that you come and pray with us. And then people signed it. And I know those guys, and all they want to do is pray. And I've told the governor, and I've told his friends, this is not a trick where they're going to get you down there and then beg for their clemency. They simply just want to pray with you and for you, and you pray for them. That is it. That's the only agenda. And so we would go on Mondays before the execution and deliver that letter to the governor. He's never done that. He's never gone to pray with them, and he's never stopped an execution as well. And so, again, because of COVID, that stopped one of the guys who was supposed to be executed but got postponed because of COVID is a guy named Purvis Payne. And Purvis is a good friend of mine, and Purvis is innocent. He's been on death row for over 30 years. He did not do the crime that he was convicted of, and he was within, he was supposed to be executed during COVID, but because of the delay, the Innocence Project, which is a national organization, took up his case, and they got some new evidence admitted, or some evidence that people tried to hide, the prosecution tried to hide actually, and they got that heard, and he actually goes back to Memphis this Friday for a hearing that could result hopefully in a new trial. Hopefully he'll get clemency, which means that he will go free. Not his sentence changed to life, but he will actually go free. I am an abolitionist when it comes to the death penalty. I don't think we should be doing that. I think there's other ways that God would have us. I believe in restorative justice instead of punitive justice, and all the death penalty is punitive. There's no restoration, reconciliation that takes place with that. You don't teach people that killing is wrong by killing people. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But anyway, so that's how our church got involved. There are other people in our church who go to death row now, and then our church is also, again, still involved in other local prisons, and again, as well as the prisons in Honduras. I've been to about 4 or 5 of the different prisons in Honduras, and so for whatever reason, this is what God has called me to. And I tell people this about prison ministry as a whole. You don't go into prisons, and this is definitely true with death row, you don't go into prisons with the idea that you're going to take Jesus in there with you. In fact, if that's where you're going, don't go. And I have to be honest, that was a little bit of my motivation. Well, these people are going to die. I need to go in there and tell them about Jesus. But you don't go into prisons to take Jesus with you. You go into prisons to meet Jesus, because he's already there. And that's just the fact. On Unit 2, there's a certain amount of peace. There's a certain amount of contentment. All the guards love when it comes their time to go to Unit 2, because it's a safe place, it's a quiet place, it's a solemn place, especially when executions are coming up. But it's not like the other prisons. Unit 1 and 3 are supermax. And I go into Units 1 and 3, and those Units 1 and 3 are interesting. I mean, there's some dark stuff over there, but Unit 2, there's a special place in my heart for those guys. And so I know all of the guys. Again, some of them are closer to me than others. But anyway, so let me show you what these pictures are, and then I'd rather talk about what you want to talk about when it comes to the death penalty. So think about questions you want to ask me, and there'll be no off limits. I'll do my best to answer them. I showed you this picture of Kevin Burns. He's from West Memphis, Arkansas, and his dad and 2 of his brothers are ministers. He really felt God called him into ministry, but he kind of got he got off track and got caught up into something. And but now he's really my pastor. That's what I tell people. This is my pastor. Because I can go and I can tell him what I'm struggling with, and he motivates me. If you met Kevin any day of the week and you say how you're doing, he'd say today's the best day of my life. All right, today is the best day of my life, and he's always smiling. Now, since I've gotten to know him, he's told me some of his bad days, kind of thing. But he is truly a remarkable person, considering all that has happened to him. Again, this one you can't see too good, but this is a picture of the crucifixion and then just kind of the scales of justice. And a guy named Kenneth painted this, and actually an organization out of Chicago called me, and they were going to come to Franklin, the downtown area of Franklin, and they were going to do a Stations of the Cross kind of thing with artwork displayed at different businesses. And so you go get a guide, and you go into business to business, and there were about 12 businesses that had different paintings or art about Easter. And so they wanted to know, they asked if I could find anybody on death row who might do something. And so I had a friend on death row paint this. This is a copy of the actual painting. And so a little bit of it's gone off if you come up and look at it. But this was actually on display in Franklin, and then the group in Chicago kept it from them. I've also asked this guy, he hasn't done it yet, but he's supposed to paint about 7 or 8 pictures of Jesus' parables for me. And with the goal that when he gets those painted, I'm going to preach a series of parables on Jesus and then use those paintings in the sermon. I think that'd be a pretty cool idea to hear his interpretation of that. But anyway, so that's what this is. Over here, this painting hangs above my desk, so I get to look at it all day long. Another inmate, his nickname is St. Louis. He was a Army veteran, helped build the Panama Canal, so he's an older gentleman now. And I just love old churches, so I asked him to paint me a scene with an old church, and he painted the old church and then somebody in a buggy, so he went above and beyond. This is like a really, really old church kind of thing, and then I had the frame put on, but you can see his name on the bottom, St. Louis, and so this is real special to me. St. Louis has asked me to be his spiritual advisor. He's expecting his date to come up the next round of dates from that, and so St. Louis is his name. And then this is a church. I need a new battery in it, so the clock doesn't work, but one of the inmates named Oscar has done that. I've got a couple other clocks in one of our group homes that we operate, but they know I love churches, and so he made that. Didn't tell me he was making it for me. He made that and then gave it to me. When they give you stuff like this, it has to go through the prison. It's really, really a process. In other words, I just can't take them out, but they have to get it approved and go through the prison. And then every day I wear this cross. Another inmate gave me this cross. His sentence has actually been turned over to life. He's off death row now. But a guy named Leonard made this cross for me. And it's a little bit heavy, so when I wear it, I can feel it. And it's just a reminder when I feel it to pray for the prisoner, which is what the Bible tells us to do, to visit the prisoners and to pray for them as if we were in prison with them. And Leonard is in his, he's about mid-70s now, and in over a 7-year period, he has been incarcerated like 53 of his 73 years of life, from juvenile detention all the way to now. And when I met him, he couldn't read or write. Now, this is his story. And but he, for whatever reason, he and I clicked, and I didn't know this until after it all happened. But I went to see him one day, or he came, to the group that we were having, and he said, "I need to tell you a story because all this has happened since you've been coming in." I didn't have anything to do with it, but God did. But he had hated God, and for some reason there was a connection between him and I, and so he said he had never been in a schoolhouse his entire life, never stepped foot inside a schoolhouse. So he couldn't read, couldn't write. And so he was always getting in fights. And so he said, "I told God one night that if he would teach me to read, I would believe in him." And so then he opened up his Bible and he read. Now it was rough, he was stuttering, but he read. And I looked at the other inmates and they all said, "No one has come by to teach him how to read. We don't know how he has learned to read, but he has learned to read." And so then every time I would go, he would always tell me what he was reading next. So he said, God taught me how to read. I know how to read. I put my faith in him. And so he put his faith in him. He's now in Unit 6, which is general population over there. So all these guys' stories, everybody on death row is there because they have been convicted of murder. Some of them readily admit that they did it. Some of them will tell you they didn't, and I believe them. Others will tell you they didn't, but I'm not quite sure if I believe them or not. But they all have stories. Most of them come from abusive backgrounds. Not all of them. Kevin grew up in a relatively stable environment, but most of them were abused themselves and got involved in things at a very young age, and then has ended up to where they are now. Now I can talk all evening, but I'd rather talk about what you want me to talk about. When you think about the death penalty and capital punishment, what are some of your questions? What are some things that you have in mind? And that may lead us to where, that'll lead our discussion. Don't be afraid. I'm not going home till tomorrow. So.
Do you deal with women prisoners as well as men prisoners?
Outside of death row, yes. But there's only one lady on death row, and she's at the women's prison. Not Riverbend Maximum Security Prison is all men. Down the road a couple miles is the women's prison. And the lady down there, she's in solitary because the death row inmates can't be with the general population. She's the only woman, so she's basically by herself. And the prisons have asked the Supreme Court to set her date, and that was during COVID. They wanted the Supreme Court to set her date from that. So outside of death row, yes, but on death row, no, it's just the guys.
This is a big ask, but how do we move the state of Tennessee to put an end to the death penalty, to move toward restorative justice completely?
Yeah, I mean, you just got to keep putting pressure on the governor right now because of the way things are in our state. I don't think it's going to happen. I think if some pressure would have been put on Governor Haslam, I think was really close to doing it, and you know, he just wrote a book where he talked about the death penalty a little bit. And so I think Governor Haslam, if the winds would have been a little bit right, would have had the courage. I don't have much hope for Governor Lee to do it, but it would take an amendment to the state constitution, which is what's difficult. Now, the governor could do it all by himself. Governor Clement, I think it was, back in the 60s, just got rid of the death penalty and gave everybody on death row, changed all their sentences to life in prison. And then it was made illegal from the federal government, the death penalty was as a whole. And then in 1976, it was determined that no, every state could do it if they wanted to. And I think around 30 some odd states have the death penalty. The other 20 or so don't have it. And there's been 3 or 4 states in the last couple of years that have gotten rid of it. But for us, because I've talked to some senators about it, it would take a change of attitude, but then everybody would have to vote on it. So it'd have to get on the ballot and everybody vote whether or not they want it or not. But overall, the attitudes have changed. And I think across the country, by a slim majority, most people oppose it by just a slim majority from that. So, you know, it's just pressure. Like I said, the governor, there was one person who was executed who I really thought if the governor is going to give anybody clemency, if he's going to stop any execution, it would be his. Because, and this particular guy, he had his wife killed, and his stepdaughter was just a child at the time. He and his stepdaughter have reconciled, and the stepdaughter was petitioning the governor not to execute him. And he had converted, he had changed his life, you know, and was an elder in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I thought, man, if the governor gives anybody clemency, it would be him, and he didn't stop it. And so I'm not sure if he would stop at all. I think he'll step in on Purvis Payne's case because there's no political disadvantage to that, you know, because it seems obvious and more people are saying Purvis was done wrong, and so I don't think he would lose any political capital by right now, since it's all in the appeals process. Then he just won't get a date. Right? As soon as people get on death row, they're given a date immediately. But that date never comes to fruition. That date sparks all the appeals that they're entitled to. And so the average person across the country on death row from the time they're sentenced to they're actually executed is well over 20 years. And the problem with that is, even if the person, this is my opinion, even if the person is guilty of what they're convicted of, 20 years later, they're not the same person who did that. And for 20 years, the victim's families have to relive this over and over again through all the appeals process. So it's not even justice for the families. You know, if a person truly did, you know, if a person killed somebody and they were given life and sent to the backside of the prison, and then all the money we spend on appeals, have some type of fund where the victims' families can get counseling, their kids can go to school. In a sense, those families can move forward. They're never going to forget about it, right? But they could move forward with their lives. Whereas this whole process is not justice for anybody, and it's truly not justice for the victim's family. It's like a reoccurring nightmare every time you got to go to court because of another appeal that's going on. But you don't want to stop the appeals, because then the likelihood of killing an innocent person increases. You know, roughly the national average is somewhere between 3 to 5% of people on death row are not guilty of the crime that put them on death row. And so we have killed innocent people in the past. And if you don't have the appeals process, then more and more people who didn't do the crime would end up getting executed, I think. Yes, ma'am.
Do you work with the families in addition to the inmates?
We don't. There are other, or I don't, but there are other groups who do. And and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, it's not that you're taking sides, but it's you know, if that victim's family knows that you have the relationship with the person who has convicted them, then that could be a problem. Now, there's one execution where the daughter wanted to have forgiveness. I did speak to her, and she and I corresponded, and we talked together. But the other times, there's other groups and other people who do that. I would love to. I wish I could talk to all the victims' families, but I know because of the emotions, some of them, you know, would not want to talk to somebody who is actually talking to the person who was convicted of killing their loved one. I had my wife's cousin was murdered, and so I kind of know that side of it, because I preached his funeral, and then when the person who killed him did not get death, he got really a light sentence. And the first time he came up for parole, I wrote a letter, you know, on behalf of the family, do not, you know. But then eventually the guy got out. He did about 12 years and got out. I hope he's doing well. I don't know where he is, but there was a love triangle thing, and he only served about 12 years from that. So I hope he's doing well, but I don't know. So I understand the victim side of the family, but I think because of what I do, most of the victims' families, they would not want to talk to me, I think. So I pray that they get the help that they need from that. And they got to find forgiveness in order to move on.
And I don't know if my question will make sense. From inside the prison system, is the death penalty even a deterrent for people? I mean, I don't know if it's going to come out right, but you know, I see the death penalty as, you know, this is the ultimate punishment.
Yeah.
Is that something that they say, gosh, if I'd known I'd really get a death sentence, I wouldn't have done the crime? Or
Right.
Is there any kind of a feeling on the prison population that we don't want to have to go there?
No.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, studies have shown across the board that the death penalty is not a deterrent, because a lot of the crimes end up being crimes of passion, where, you know, you're not really thinking about the future, you're upset right then and there. And it's amazing how many people, because see, this is true of every prisoner, but it's just not easily available. But for anybody on death row, all you got to do is look them up, and you can read everything about them. You know, and so it's really amazing how many, you know, it was their girlfriend, or it was their wife, or it was, you know, and it was a crime of punishment. And then there was drugs and alcohol involved, and that's not to excuse any of it. I hope you're not taking it that way, but there were drugs and alcohol involved, and the deterrent of the death penalty is just not going to come into play there. And you know what's interesting to me is I can go to the other units 1 and 3 in particular, and there are people in there who have killed 3, 4, 5, 6 people, and they got life without parole. They're never going to get out of prison, but they didn't get the death penalty. And then you go to death row, and most of the cases on death row were single homicide. Not that that's any better, but it was, you know, one person, and this person gets death, this person gets life, And so the arbitrary nature of it is where it becomes really an injustice from that. And that's where race comes into play. And it's not so much the race of the person, it's the race of the victim. And so what studies have shown is if a white female gets murdered, the odds of that person getting death are greatly increased. If it's a white female and it's a black male who did the murder, then the odds really increase that they'll get death. But if it's a white male, or if it's a black male who's killed, or it's a white person who did it, then the odds of getting death are not as great. There's a saying on death row that there's no one rich on death row. You know, most of them have public defenders, and that opens up another can of worms. I have a good friend who wrote, he's a lawyer, and he wrote, this was in the journal, the Tennessee Law Journal, I don't know what the official thing, and he sent me a copy of it before he printed it, and I was like, dude, I don't understand half of this, it was all illegal, send me the abstract. But he researched every capital punishment, every execution in the state of Tennessee, and his conclusion was that there's no rhyme or reason as to who gets it and who doesn't. None of it makes any sense at all.
The men are classified as B and C in solitary.
Mm-hmm.
What access to, I know they're solitary, but access to any activity, books, TV, how do they spend their time?
Yeah, now they can't have televisions and radios. They have to purchase them, through commissary, and it's just basic TV. They don't have cable, so it's just basic TV, and they're really interesting because the radios and the TVs are clear, so you can see inside, so they can't hide anything in there. They can get access to books. Of course, their lawyers can come see them anytime they want to. But that's about it. They don't have they don't have jobs. They can't go and work on crafts. Some of them they can get art material in their cell and they'll paint and do things like that. A lot of them they just spend their entire time working on their case, and a lot of them have become pretty good lawyers. A lot of times, what happens is it's the inmate who finds something in their case, and then they tell their lawyer about it, and then the lawyer will verify it and find out that, yeah, there was something mishandled, or this is not the right way, but because they've got all that time on their hand. A lot of them will write. There's a guy, he recently died of natural causes a couple months ago, and I think he had a photogenic memory, so he was a psychopath. That's his designation, and he will tell you he killed 3 people. He didn't get the death penalty until the 3rd person. He was in prison. He killed his mom, and then while he was in prison, he killed his cellmate, and then he killed his prison counselor. And when he killed the counselor, he got sent. I can tell you this now because he's passed away. He got sent to death row then. And in his mind, his way of thinking, he doesn't really understand what he did because he warned everybody 3 times before he killed them. And since they didn't do anything to stop it, then it's their fault. He told the prison 3 times, if you don't get me a new cellmate, I want to kill him. And so it's the prison's fault, right? And he told, if you don't get me a new counselor, I'm going to kill him. So it's the prison's fault that he told his mom 3 times. And his story of abuse is really quite traumatic. That doesn't, I'm not excusing it, but it's really quite traumatic, some of the things that he told me. But he believed in the death penalty, so in his mind, the only way he had any chance of going to heaven was if he was killed for that. And but he was a Bible scholar. And before he died, he was going through the Bible on his own and making a list of all the names in the Bible and all the passages in the Bible where that name occurs. And he was in C, I think, and it was already hundreds of pages. Now I want to tell you, there's people who've already done that. But that's what he would do. He would read the Bible himself and cross-reference it and keep a list, handwritten list of all those names and where they were found.
I have a few questions. I just want to make sure my hearing aids are hearing what you're saying.
Okay?
The current governor, he ran on the death penalty?
He ran on his Christian faith, very, very strong. Like everybody who runs for office in the South is going to say they're a Christian, right? But Governor Lee put his faith right out there in the public. Now, I know him, and I don't question his faith at all from that, but he ran on it, and then he also ran on a strong prison reform. And so since he was so vocal about his faith and his love for prisoners, the guys on death row wrote him a letter saying, come pray with us. And he has refused. Now, the governor's pastor is a good friend of mine. And he and I talked about it, and he asked me questions about what would happen. And I tried to explain to him how it was going to be safe. And then I go back to the inmates and I tell them that the pastor wanted to know if they would be in shackles or handcuffs. And I was like, no. But all the guys on death row said, we'll do, if they want us to be shackled and handcuffed so we can talk to the governor, we'll do that. We just want to pray with him. And so they were willing to really, be treated, and these would be all A inmates, all A-level inmates. None of the B or C inmates would have been able to get near the governor. This would have been the A-level, the ones who are safe. And but for whatever reason, and I think I know why. I mean, once you meet, the thing about it, once you meet these guys, it's the proximity. You think that the people on death row are monsters, or a lot of people do. And then when you meet them, when you hear their stories, and you realize, man, they look like my kids. They grew up in church like I did. But, something happened. And usually what happened was either some type of physical or sexual abuse from a parent, or drugs and alcohol is usually what happened. Or gang. There's a few of them there who it was gang related.
Well, when you said that, I was just really curious. What does that say about the people of the state of Tennessee who vote for something like that? I mean, Bible Belt, we go to church, we believe in this. That's not what Jesus is teaching us.
Right.
I'm just having a hard time understanding all that. I just shake my head.
Yeah, I can tell you, because I grew up in a denomination that did not view this. Now, I can tell you, I wasn't vocally opposed to the death penalty like I am now. But all my life growing up, it bothered me. And then I would hear what my pastor or what Bible teachers would say, and I was just like, okay, I don't know if I agree with that or not, but I wasn't really in a position to say anything about it. But basically, they'll go back to Genesis, where the Noahic covenant, where it says basically, if you take a life, you give a life. And they'll say that since it's the Noahic covenant, not the Mosaic covenant, then that still applies to us today. The law of Moses doesn't, unless it's moral issues, but the Noah covenant still applies for us. And so since that's what the Bible says, then under certain circumstances, the death penalty would be okay, and it would actually be the right thing to do, is what they say. Now, I don't agree with that anymore by any means. In fact, I've written about it and have spoken about it a lot, about why that is faulty. And then a anti-death penalty group used a quote of mine for many years that said, even if you can justify the death penalty, we cannot do it justly, so we shouldn't do it at all. So even if you could take the Bible and build a case for it, well, we can't do it. There's no way we can do it the right, where it's absolutely foolproof. And the idea, well, most of the time we get it right, it's good enough, that just doesn't sit well with me. I hope that answers your question, but that's why, because I struggle with, it's kind of weird, because most people who are pro-life are pro-death penalty. And then most people who are pro-choice are anti-death penalty. And I'm like, well, and it's like, well, to me, pro-life would be that you're against the death penalty. Pro-life means life. And people will say, yeah, but the baby's innocent. I say, okay, even better. Jesus came for the guilty. Right? One story. Do you have another question, though?
Well, you go ahead. If I don't, the old gray cells forget very quickly.
All right.
This is hard for me to even, the concept is just really hard for me to deal with. I'm a retired home health hospice nurse, so death and dying is, it's a very natural, it's a very beautiful, moving thing. But I just can't imagine being an individual and having known these people and knowing that they're executed. Can you talk about your feelings towards these?
Yeah, it's tough, and it gets harder, especially, we went through this period of time when in about a year and a half, there were 8 of them. And I knew all 8 of them, and some of them I knew better than others, and so obviously your heart breaks all the time, but the ones you know are really the ones that get to you. And so you see the injustice of it, but then ultimately, you find comfort in the grace of God. It doesn't make it right, doesn't help a whole lot, but it's, it meant like here you find small victories, I guess, and this may sound odd, but this last guy, Stephen Hughley, who died of natural causes a couple of months ago, I was at home, and his daughter called me to tell me. Well, that meant a whole lot. I mean, I hated that he was dead, but his daughter was like, I know he would want you to be one of the first to know that he has passed away. And so you just kind of, okay, God's grace was seen in a horrible situation. And I don't doubt that person's eternal soul, because I know his story, and I know, and so to me, if God's grace is not big enough for Stephen Hughley, then it's not big enough for me, kind of thing. So that's what you do, but it becomes difficult, and then you become really good friends with the other people who are there. So you automatically have something in common with the people who are there, and so some of my best friends are people who I know are going to be there on those nights and who are going to stand with me and then support afterwards, call a few days later, hey, how you feeling, how you doing? Because they know it happens on a Thursday, I'll be there on Friday morning. Now, for the inmates, the other guys on death row, when the guards come and get them on Sunday or Monday, actually leading up to that, they say their goodbyes, and then they don't watch the news. And so from their perspective, when that person leaves Unit 2, they're dead. And they start the grieving process. And they always have a last supper for them. They get their commissary together, and I don't know, it's prison food or commissary, and they'll just throw ramen noodles and all this stuff together and make something, and then whatever pod that inmate is in, everybody will eat together and say their goodbyes, and then the inmate will divide up his stuff and give it to different inmates that are there. And then now there was a case, this is horrible, a guy named Diamond Jim, who he was sentenced to be executed, and they came and got him on a Sunday or Monday. On Friday, I told him bye. We had our kind of last conversation. They came and got him. He was to be executed on Thursday. Wednesday night, he got a stay. So when I go back to Riverbend on Friday, he's back in his cell, But then 2 weeks later, they come and get him again and execute him. So imagine that. Twice, you go all the way and come back, and then go all the way back. It's cruel and unusual punishment at that time. What that does to you, to your psyche. There's a lot of guys who get within days of being executed. Some of them have been within hours of being executed and have gotten a stay. But as far as I know, he's the only one that I knew, or anyone would talk about, that got a stay and 2 weeks later was executed.
So what, can I ask you a question? Let's see. Okay. What do we do to change to reverse this process?
You talk to your local state representatives, tell them that you're opposed to the death penalty. And since they did this, I think it's really a good time now, because they did since they stayed all the executions during COVID, why not now just get rid of it totally and commute the people's sentences to life? Now, for me, I'm opposed to life without parole. Now, some people aren't, but it's like, you know what? If you're not going to kill them, give them life without parole. But that's a whole other thing, because life without parole is basically the death penalty again. And you take away people's hope to ever get out, but then they could become a very dangerous person if there's no hope of anything ever changing. Why should I even, why should I? So you just got to contact your senators. Tennessee Alternative to the Death Penalty. You can look that up, Google it. Tennesseans for an Alternative to the Death Penalty is a statewide organization, and they have different petitions and different things you can do. They have a day on the Hill where you can go and talk personally to your senator about whatever issue you want to talk about, and they have a day when it's devoted to the death penalty, and you can hear them, and you just got to keep doing that. I write editorials about it. I mean, I talk about it, and I get under the governor's skin. The one time on a Monday before an execution, we were there, and I'd met the governor again before he became governor, but I know we had a lot of mutual friends, and they were telling us he's not there, and we were about to leave, and the governor came walking down the hall. And so my friend went up and introduced himself. I introduced myself. I said, my name is Kevin. He stopped me and said, I know who you are. And I said, oh, okay.
Did he just walk away from you?
No, he talked to us and let us pray for him. And I prayed that he would overturn the death penalty. But no, he was gracious. And I've seen him around Franklin from time to time. And again, we got a lot of mutual friends. And so I had one person leave my church because he and the governor were best friends. And because I was attacking the governor, he thought that I just can't come to church. Yeah, but that's why I'm very clear. Like when the reporters call me and they want my opinion, I always say, please print. I am not questioning his faith. The reason I'm doing this is because I believe. So it's one Christian brother trying to talk to another Christian brother who thinks that they've erred. And the reason I'm so careful about that is because I've got so many friends who are friends of his, and if they think I'm questioning his faith, they're going to get upset with me. I don't want to upset with me about that. Before we leave, somebody say a boo, because that's a story I want to tell. So if I forget, just say a boo, and then that'll remind me.
What is the age range that you see on death row? And are there many prisoners on death row that actually live old enough and just die on death row before they're ever executed?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's because they're old. There's a lot of prisoners who die of natural causes. So the average age is about my age, 55, give or take on either side. And most of them now have been there 25. The one guy's been there, I think, is coming up on 36 years, and he's the longest from that. But most of them have been there multiple years. Since I've been going, there's only been 2 people added to death row. And so there's not a whole lot of people being put on death row anymore like there used to be. At one time, there were over 100 people on death row, maybe close to 200, back when they were at that old prison where Green Mile was filmed. And KB, when he came on death row, there was right at 100, and now there's less than 50. So imagine, you asked how I feel, you got to imagine how these inmates feel, because their entire world are these fellow inmates. And so they really do become like a family. And so can you imagine in a short period of time, either through natural causes or execution, 12, 15 of your family members die, and you don't have any, you're not adding more family. Every time somebody dies, that's just one less person, basically, who basically. And so that trauma, some people are saying, well, that's what, don't do the crimes, you can't do the time. But that's just the reality of the trauma that they're under. Every time somebody dies, that's one less person who they know, and the odds, and so their world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And these guys, even A level, all right. So KB, Kevin has been in prison on death row for close to 30 years. During that time, so for 30 years, the sun has never shined down on him. And he has not felt grass. Because everything is concrete. And when you go outside to the yard, you're still in a pen, concrete pen with an overhang. And so you haven't had direct sunlight on you, and you haven't felt dirt or grass. And so even though some people think those A guys got it pretty easy, can you imagine that you can't even touch grass or feel the sun on the top of your head. You can sit near the edge outside and get it on your arm. but on top of your head.
I have two questions. First, how do they stay sane? Like,
Good question. In fact, I asked Purvis permission because I'm thinking about using it in a sermon. So Purvis Payne, he is innocent, and he's been on death row now 30-some odd years, and so he's kind of nervous. He's been institutionalized. So if he is set free, what's he going to do, right? I mean, 30-some odd years, he's institutionalized. But I asked him just week before last. I said, man, you got. Because I've asked Kevin this before, but so I asked Purvis. I said, how do you? 30 years for something you didn't even do, and he had no criminal. I mean, he wasn't like I tell some people. There's a lot of people on death row. They may be innocent of the crime that put them on death row, but they're not choir boys. They were involved in all kinds of stuff, and but not Purvis. Purvis was not like that. And so, how did you keep from becoming bitter? How did you keep from losing hope? And he was very poignant. He told me different times in his life where he has been incredibly bitter and incredibly hateful, and mad at God. Now, he comes from a Christian family. He's got family members who are Church of God in Christ pastors. And so he said, but during those times of my deepest despair, usually through a dream, he said Jesus would come and speak to him, and that would help. And then his family. And he said, my family always believed I'm innocent. And then for whatever reason, he mentioned his grandfather. He said, my grandfather, until the day he died, believed in me. And that's what's given me strength, that there's people who believe in my innocence. And that's what's kept me sane. Now, on the other side, what I have seen is, in my short period of time, if a person is on death row, one or two things happen to them. One is they accept it, and so they accept, if they did it, they accept responsibility, and they ask for forgiveness, and God's grace comes in, and they just kind of accept it, and they let the course run itself, and they try to make the best of their bad situation. All right, and in a sense, they handle it mentally. Does that make any sense? On the other hand, are those people who maybe they didn't do it, or they did do it and they don't want to admit they did it. And so for whatever reason, they are consumed 24 hours a day with getting their freedom. Now, I kind of think that's how I would be. But that's all they think about, and that's all they do, and they end up driving themselves crazy. And I've seen that just in the time I've been there, that over the course of 5 or 6 years, these people who seem somewhat sane when I first met them, you can just tell they're mentally they're not making it. And so, that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's it. And then they become, like I said, they become a very close family among themselves, and they lift each other up. There was a minister, I didn't know him, there was a pastor who killed his wife and ended up on death row. And KB tried to befriend him, but after about 5 or 6 years, the pastor ended up hanging himself in his cell. And so he drove himself crazy.
do you work towards other prison reform
Yes.
things other than just death row?
Yes, the life without parole, especially life without parole that's given to juveniles, and there's been traction on that. The Supreme Court has ruled, and then Trump overturned it, but hopefully Biden will put it back, that you cannot give life without parole to a juvenile. You can give them life, but not life without parole. And then the state of Tennessee, it's gone through some hearings, it's not finalized yet, but Tennessee is really, really close to making life without parole, or life with parole, a 25-year max instead of a 51-year max. So right now, if a person goes to prison and they get life with the possibility of parole, it's a minimum of 51 years before they're up for parole. Most people in prison, very few people who are in prison live 50 years in prison. Regardless of what age they are when they go to prison, something will happen within that 50 years and they'll die. And so you move it down to 20. Now here's what happens at the parole process. So if I get life with parole, it's a minimum of 25. More than likely, I'm going to get denied the first time I come up for parole. And then you can only apply for parole every 5 years. So I do 25 years, I get denied, I'm going to be in 30 years before I get it. And then maybe 30, 35 years, if I've got good behavior, then I'll get parole. But giving life without parole to a juvenile is that's the most, I don't know how it could be more. You say, well, they were adults. Well, if you know anything about psychology, your brain's not even fully developed now. They say to about 26 or 27 years old. And so you do something when you're 15, and life without parole, and so those are the two issues to me: capital punishment and then the life without parole kind of things are really what's to me what needs to be done. And then just, I've done some activism on cash bail systems. The bail system is horrible. Because if you're a person who is poor and you get arrested for a simple misdemeanor, and your bail may be set at $1,000, which means you got to come up with $100. You don't have that $100, so you have to sit in jail until your hearing. And during that time, if you got a job, you're going to lose your job. You're going to be evicted from your apartment. And so this cashless bail system is an injustice also. Where there's a lot of people who sit in jail for long periods of time who have not been sentenced to anything. And when you're in that situation, you can't do anything. You can't work. All you literally do is sit around and watch TV all day, because until your hearing or until your sentencing, you can't go to any programs. You're just there. And it could have been a simple misdemeanor. It might not even be a violent crime. And that's where you are from that. That was a long answer.
I have another question. And I don't even know what the right words are, because justice is not the right word. But if things go in Purvis's favor now, if all that works out, what happens to him? He's been in for 30 plus years. He has no work experience that anybody's going to take. He'll have no money. How does he survive after that?
He has a strong family network, a real strong family, and so that will be in his favor. It depends on what happens. Like for example, let's just say he's given a new trial, which to me would be the prosecutor's easy way out. Okay, we're going to take the death penalty off. You got this new evidence. We're just going to give him a new trial. Or they'll try to, and then the new trial, he's found guilty again, but instead of death, he'll get he might get life with the possibility of parole. At that point, he's been in 30 some odd years, so without a write-up, so they would parole him, and he would go home, but the charge would still be on him. Okay, so that would be a win. It'd be a win for Purvis because he's free, even though he didn't do it, but it'd also be a win for the prosecution. But what we're asking for is, no, his record is wiped clean. It's shown that he did not do this. He was wrongfully incarcerated for 30 plus years. At that point, the state's going to owe him a lot of money.
Good.
Yeah. And so being able to work won't really be an issue. But you can see how the state is going to fight that every step of the way, and they're going to try to plea bargain something out of that. Because if they can get him a plea bargain and hold this carrot, we're going to let you go, but we're not going to drop the charges. Well, Purvis is going to take that plea bargain because he wants to go home. But it's going to be people around him saying, no, don't take that. You got to get your record wiped clean, and then there would be some, you get paid something for being wrongfully incarcerated for 30 some odd years. But yeah, he won't be able to do anything. He does have a learning disability, but he's around my age, but thankfully he has a strong family. His sister lives in Murfreesboro, and she's the one who's really been driving this. And then he's got family members. His dad still, I think his mom passed away in Memphis. And then with the Innocent Project being behind him, there'll be avenues available to him because he's gotten all this national attention. PurvisPayne.com if you want to look up his case.
Was he recently on Dateline or one of those?
But he could have been. He would have been all over the news because he had a hearing back in the summer. And so he went back to Memphis, and that got incredible amounts of news coverage. I'm sure that with the Innocence Project, it's got national coverage. There was a rally on his behalf a couple weeks ago where at different cities people were just standing on the corners, and I went to Murfreesboro to be with his sister. And there were rallies for purpose from California to New York to England to France. I mean, all over the world there were people saying free purpose pain. You know, I mean, it has gone, it really has gone global from that.
This is a little bit away from just death row, but a question that I have. My last service as pastor before I retired was in Virginia. And states are different, the way they handle things. And I was a part of the chaplaincy service of the state of Virginia for the prison systems and so forth. And I was in a lot of the prisons and so forth. The question that I have kind of follows up on that question that was over there. How in the world do we change the political influence on things? When the first time I was on the chaplaincy board, the political party that was in charge of the state at that particular time kind of had the attitude, throw them in prison and throw the key away.
Yeah.
And the prisons were horribly overcrowded, many of whom were not violent at all and shouldn't have been there. How in the world do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, again, the way our system is set up is through the political channels, and so you have to vote for people, vote people in office who will tell you before they're elected that they're against the death penalty or they're really wanting prison reform. And by prison reform, there's a whole lot more issues in this, but prison reform have to do with life without parole and cash bail and mandatory minimums. Those are kind of the issues that you want to know where a politician stands on those things. So even if it's not the death penalty, where do you stand on life without parole? Where do you stand on mandatory minimums? Or where do you stand on the bail systems and the injustice that is? We have a two-tier justice system. We have one system that's for people who can afford it, and then you have another system for everybody else. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what happens. There's kind of among inmates, there's kind of a saying, you know what you call a person with a public defender? Guilty. That's what happens. I mean, they're just not going to, because those public defenders are overwhelmed, they're not going to look into it as detailed. Now, fortunately for the guys on death row, once they get sentenced to death and they start the appeals process, there are federal lawyers, there's federal things, and there's really, really good lawyers who take up their cases, and that's all they do, are capital cases like this. And so at that point, they get really, really good lawyers. And right now, there's 3 guys who were on death row when I started going to death row, and their sentences have been commuted to life without parole. And so they're on the other side of the prison, so I can go see them from that. But their sentences have been commuted to that. It's usually because of some type of misconduct by their lawyer or by the jury, that there's still no question of their innocence. But if this fact would have been known, they would not have gotten death. They would have gotten this other sentence. Now, there's a couple of them over there who have life with parole. One of them, I think in 2 years, he was on death row, and in 2 years he'll be up for parole now. Now, he may or may not get it, but he could possibly get it. The thing to keep in mind is 95% of people in prison right now across the country, 95% of people in prison are going to be released one day. And so they're going to go back out into the community. And so if you treat them like animals, lock them up and throw away the key, then they become a more dangerous person once they get outside. But through all the programs, and most of the programs in prisons are run by churches. And so we could be thankful for that. It's like, okay, we need work for restorative justice because 95% of them are going to be your neighbors eventually. And how they're treated on the inside will have a lot to do with what happens when they get out. And if we don't do anything to help them get out, then they're going to go back in. There was a guy in Unit 1, which is Max, and a young guy. He was in his 30s. And I would go and talk to him a lot. And he fell through the cracks. And so he had been in solitary confinement for 7 years, which is totally unconstitutional, by the way, but for 7 years. And his end date was coming up where they had to release him. And under a normal process, you were in there, they would go from a max to a step down kind of thing, kind of get some social services wrapped around them to prepare them for their release. Well, he went straight from max back out to the street. You know, and we tried to help him as a church, but he wanted to go back home to Jackson, Tennessee, where his family was, and I lost contact with him. But the odds of him staying out of prison are slim. I mean, because there was no preparation for his, and that's because for many of us, the justice system is punitive. Don't do the crime unless you do the time. That's all it's about, is punishment instead of restorative from that. All right, and then Abu.
Yeah. The question was asked, how do the death row inmates stay sane? How does the death row chaplain stay sane?
Well, at Riverbend, there's been a high turnover of chaplains since I've been there. You know, as far as people, now there's a friend of mine, I won't mention his name, but he's been doing death row ministry across the country. And when Diamond Jim was executed, Diamond Jim was one of his closest friends that he built a relationship with. And before, he's in his 70s now, this minister. But he could not come to the vigil, and he said he cannot go to death row anymore. He cannot take it anymore willingly after about 30 some odd years of doing this type of ministry. So it does wear on you. It really does. But what keeps me going, again, is this is what God has called me to do, and just trying to bring a little bit of grace. But then also, what those guys do more for me than I do for them. They have shown me, you know, unconditional love across the board, whether or not they're a Christian or not. They've shown me unconditional love. They act like they're glad to see me when I'm there. You know, I didn't see them for 15 months, and that really bothered me. You know, but then you go back, it's like a long lost friend. They're thankful, and the thing is, prisoners in general, they have a really, really good BS indicator. They know who's real and who's not. You can't con, in other words, right? And so when they accept you, and because they know that you're real, then it's okay, here's a little bit of grace, here's the love of Christ. And you know, Jesus was executed by the state for a crime he didn't commit. You know, and so Jesus is there. And that's kind of what keeps you sane. Abu's been on death row for quite a while, another 30 plus years, and Abu was abused horribly as a child, and then he got sent to, when he was in juvenile detention as a juvenile, some older boys repeatedly raped him, and so that's just kind of his background. He moved to Nashville back in the 80s and was involved in there was a group of African-American black pastors in Nashville who were kind of vigilantes. They wanted to clean up the streets in North Nashville. And so they kind of had, they didn't want to kill anybody, but they kind of had hitmen who, you know, if you were selling drugs on the corner, they would go and say, you either stop selling drugs or we're going to beat you up, you know. And it was pastors who were sending these people out to do that, all right? It was around 1984 when all this happened. So Abu was one of those guys. So he thought he was doing God's work because the pastors would tell him, you know, go beat this drug dealer up, beat this pimp up so that they don't do this in our neighborhood anymore. And so he and another guy went to beat up this drug dealer, and something went wrong, and the drug dealer ended up being killed. Abu says he blacked out, and he had no blood on him and all that, and so it was this other guy. But the other guy was a relative to one of these pastors. And so they railroaded Abu. So Abu got sent, he has intellectual disabilities. So he got sent to death row. And so he was mad at the church. He wasn't mad at God, he was mad at the church, which you can kind of understand that, you know. And so he converted to Islam. And so he's a practicing Muslim and never had a write-up and all of that. But every week for 25 years, this group of people, mainly ladies, from an Episcopal church in Nashville, would go see him and go visit him every week for 25 years, just to be his friend. They didn't try to convert him. They just, the ministry of presence, just being there. And so for 25 years, every week, they would go visit Abu. Now, during this 25 years, on two or three occasions, he was within days, I think one time within hours of being executed, but then he would get a stay because there's all kinds of questions in his case. And so, as he was coming up to his 60th birthday, and by this time I knew him, as he was coming up to his 60th birthday, he asked these ladies, he said, "Do you think it would be all right if I converted to Christianity and became a member of your church?" Now, in the Episcopal Church, you just don't say, "I want to join," right? I mean, it's, you know, in most Baptist churches like mine, at the end of the service, "Anybody want to join?" "Oh, okay, boom, you're a member." You know, but that's not how the Episcopal Church works. And so they said yes, and so he had to start a class, and he did these classes. And so then on the day of his 60th birthday, the bishops, a couple of the bishops from across the state Episcopal Church, they came to Riverbend. The prison allowed him to have this conversion service where he could invite some people, and so Abu invited me, so I was there for this, and so I witnessed this. So this was it was in October, on his 60th birthday. And so he was going to convert back to Christianity. And so we had this service, and then where the bishop said some stuff, and then when it came time, his conversion, his sign of conversion was he was going to go to the front and take communion from the bishop. He was going to take off his kafur, the hat that the Muslims wear. He was going to take it off and fold it up, and then put a cross on his neck, and then take communion. And that was his sign of, I'm no longer a Muslim, I am a Christian and a member of the Episcopal Church. And then he sang Amazing Grace, which was really, really soulful and just wonderful. So deeply impacted me. Now, depending on your view of Scripture and what happens when somebody dies, you know, and I wrote a blog about this. Okay, what would have happened if Abu would have been executed while he was a Muslim? Depending on your view of Scripture. Does that make any sense? You know, what would have happened? And so you, conservative, which is where I come out of, conservative Christians, you would have wanted this person killed. And according to your doctrine, I know what you think would have happened to him if he would have died as a Muslim instead of a Christian. But because he did not die then, he eventually converted to Christ. So, you know, so why are you for the death penalty? You're going to, if your view of eternal life is that you're going to send people to hell, why in the world you should want those people to stay alive as long as possible? Does that make any sense? I mean, regardless, it's like you should want them to stay alive as long as possible, so that they could be, quote, redeemed at some point. And so now he's kind of in the same way as as Purvis, where there's a lot of misconduct in his trial. I'm having lunch with his lawyer this week to talk about some things that we can do to try to... he was scheduled to be executed Easter during COVID, but it got the Thursday before Easter, so on Monday, Thursday was his day. But then COVID got it delayed, and then some stuff came up in court where now he has... Actually, what happened was the judges in Nashville decided to take death off of him and give him life without parole. So they changed his sentence, and then the district attorney 2 weeks later stepped in and said, "No, you can't do that," and put the death penalty back on him. And so he's in limbo right now from that. But he'll never go free. He says he'll never go free, but hopefully he'll go to general population where he can have a tremendous influence on people in general population over there. All right, thank you so much. I'm sorry if I talk too much, but write your congressman, and Tennessee for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.org, I think is there. It may be .com or .org. Do you know which one? But anyway, Purvis Payne. Abu has a website too. I don't know how many people are named Abu, so if you just Google Abu Death Row, it'll come up. ABU is his name. I can't remember what his name was before he converted to Islam, but he kept his Islamic name when he converted back. I'm done.
All right. Thank you so much.
Over here.